DevOps news update for July 2019.
The Azure DevOps podcast is a show for developers and DevOps professionals shipping software using Microsoft technologies. Each show brings you hard-hitting interviews with industry experts, innovating better methods, and sharing success stories. Listen on to learn how to increase quality, ship quickly, and operate well. And now your host, Jeffrey Palermo.
Hello and welcome back. I am Jeffrey Palermo, your host here on the Azure DevOps podcast. Welcome to a special edition, a DevOps news edition for the first week of July 2019. Remember, you can go to www.azuredevops.show to see past shows and show notes for this and other episodes. And I really want to point you to that URL, azuredevops.show, and you can go back, and we have so many past episodes since this podcast launched. The head of the director of engineering, Buck Hodges, he was our first episode, and he kicked us off. And we've had Donovan Brown and Sam Guggenheimer and Stephen Murawski and all kinds of great guests, Damian Brady, so many that it's hard to name them all. But one of the interesting ones that I've enjoyed is going beyond and reaching out to other people in the ecosystem, like Paul Stovall, the CEO of Octopus Deploy, as well as Scott Hunter, who runs the entire .NET division. From a program management perspective at Microsoft, if it's going on in the .NET world, then he's the main instigator on that. And Paul Hack, who was the original program manager who kind of pushed out the ASP.NET MVC framework at Microsoft and then went over to GitHub. We've had him on the show. And if you've been reading Code Magazine for a while, then you know the column at the back of the magazine. Ted Neward is the author of that, and he discussed the ops side of DevOps. We've had Udi Dahan on here. He's created In-Service Bus, and we had a microservices episode. Rocky Lotka, who's been an architect for a long time. We talked about software architecture. Jeff Fritz on .NET Core 3 and Blazor. So many great episodes, and we've had some success stories recently. And if there's any particular topics or guests that you'd like to see, then just reach out to me on Twitter at Jeffrey Palermo, or send me an email, and I'd be happy to get that on the schedule. So some of the news that I wanted to get into, first of all, I'll start out by talking about some of the advances in GitHub, and the question of, okay, Microsoft acquired GitHub, and what's going to happen? What's going to happen with the default way to store source control? Version control system, we have two of them. We have Azure Repos and we have GitHub. Which one do I use? Now, if you're already using GitHub, then stay on GitHub. That's an obvious choice. However, if you're starting a new repository, then you have a choice to make. And one of the things that is not quite working in GitHub is Microsoft logins. And you can't just have seamless Azure Active Directory authentication with GitHub. So if all of your identities are tied up in Active Directory, then that might be a challenge unless you do that integration yourself or use GitHub Enterprise. However, if you're already on GitHub, then of course it's just fine. Now, one interesting feature that GitHub has added, and I'm not sure if Azure Repos is going to add this, is viewing and updating vulnerable dependencies in your repository. In the security tab on GitHub, you can go and actually learn about this vulnerable dependencies feature. And the problem statement is, if you rely on NPM or NuGet packages, and those packages depend on some other packages, then you might not know if any of those packages have known vulnerabilities and you're using an older version. And so this will actually scan the whole dependency tree and create an automated security fix. And it's really interesting. It's a new feature. We'll see how it pans out. Okay, so the next interesting capability that I want to talk about is Azure App Configuration. Azure App Configuration is basically a way for you to create feature flags and manage them in Azure. Now, up until now, Launch Darkly has had really good capability for supporting feature flags or feature toggles. But now Azure is adding it as a service where you can define and manage the feature flags, and then you can access the feature flags from your application. And gives you a capability to store all of those feature flags and administer them from a single place. And so App Configuration has a portal UI in the Azure portal named Feature Manager. And it's specifically designed for feature flags, and it also natively supports the .NET Core feature flag data schema. So this is interesting. If you go to an app service, an Azure app service, then you can go to Feature Manager and then add a feature flag. And feature A, feature B, whatever it happens to be, you can give it a key and a description, and then you can update the status right there in the portal for testing. But you can also put it in your app config, and there's file prefix extensions, .appconfig, .featureflag, and that'll also integrate with Configuration Explorer. But anyway, this is an interesting new feature, and we'll see how it pans out. It's in preview right now, but feature flags, feature toggles means the same thing. Is an up and coming method. And if you have not used those or haven't really read much about them, the big deal is that it allows you to decouple the notion of a software deployment with a software release. And without this method, those two are one and the same. If you deploy your application, you are deploying new features. Now, if there's some screens and you have an if statement somewhere and you have a web.config or app.config setting that says, oh, turn it off, then that essentially is a feature flag. But when used as a method, we essentially hide every new feature as it comes down the line, deploy to production frequently, and then let the business or marketing stakeholders and executives choose when to actually turn on those features for the user base. And so in effect, from a technical side, you deploy on a predictable cadence, and then the software can be released to the users by just flipping that switch. So that's a pretty big deal. And whether you need a mature solution right now, ready to go, and you reach for Launch Darkly, or whether you look at Azure App Configuration, it's exciting. It's pretty exciting. I also want to call out, next bit of news is a pretty lengthy and significant blog post by Gopi Chickagari. He was actually a previous guest on the podcast, and he is a group program manager in Azure Pipelines. And he is all over the place. I saw Gopi at the Build conference, and he's written a new blog called "What's New with Azure Pipelines" for May 7th, which now is a month and a half old, but this is still pretty good news because it's still taking root, still preview, or it's actually available to use, but they're continuing to improve it. And one of the big changes that's going to change the UI in Azure Pipelines is multi-stage YAML pipelines. And that's for both builds and deployments, labeled in the product continuous integration and continuous delivery. And the big change is that the product, the history of the product, Visual Studio Team Services, before they kind of broke it up into the 5 different products under the banner of Azure DevOps, there were different products that came together. And there's been a build server, which is kind of the core of Azure Pipelines, but there was also Release Manager, which is a product that was integrated and became the Release Hub. And that's been a different product, and it just works differently. And so we see from the UI, the build side of Azure Pipelines getting multi-stage YAML pipelines and being able to execute any number of stages and integrate with environments. And so with that capability, it appears that the release hub may kind of start to go by the wayside, or being completely integrated from an experience perspective, so that you can do your whole pipeline, both build and deploy, in just a one place called the pipeline, instead of being separated between build and release. And I think that makes sense, because it's obvious from the stage, if it's the continuous integration commit stage, which includes private and continuous integration builds, versus various stages of deployments. And now YAML support, if you haven't heard of that, that is a text build script for the build server. And whether you kind of read YAML to be yet another markup language, or YAML ain't a markup language, it's a text form that can be stored in your Git repository, so that you can vary build configurations on a feature branch, instead of your build configuration being a global that sometimes breaks when you do something on a feature branch that requires a build change. It is very early, and so if you are one of those who always likes to jump on the latest and greatest, then go for it. Take one of your applications, do a proof of concept. If you're hearing about this for the first time, don't feel stressed to jump on this feature right away. They are enhancing the editor experience and IntelliSense and discoverability of marketplace tasks and things like that. So there's still some kinks to work out. I've given it a go. We have clients who've given it a go, and it makes sense in some circumstances, but it doesn't make sense to just jump and convert all of your existing pipelines to the YAML format just yet. So another piece of news that I'd like to cover is server-side Blazors. Now this is .NET Framework news, but it is going to change the landscape, and so many people are talking about it. In .NET Core 3, it's rumored that we're going to have server-side Blazor, and actually on Channel 9, channel9.msdn.com, there is a show on server-side Blazor in .NET Core 3.0. And it's Shane Boyer and Daniel Roth talk about how to prepare for .NET Core 3 and server-side Blazor, which will directly compete with Angular and React and Vue and all of the other scenarios where you reached for a JavaScript SPA framework. So I'm really excited about it. And then next year sometime, there will be client-side Blazor where the front-end code actually runs inside WebAssembly. And what's so exciting about Blazor is that you'll be able to extend C# all the way from the back end into the front end, instead of having to have the back end of your application be C# and then the front end be all JavaScript, and juggling these significant amounts of code in two different major languages. So that's going to be really, really interesting.
The Azure DevOps podcast is sponsored by ClearMeasure, a software engineering firm and Microsoft Gold partner, empowering development teams to be their best. ClearMeasure equips developers with the DevOps tools, methods, and automation necessary to focus on building their applications, rather than wrestling with builds, deployments, or environments. Click clear-measure.com to see whether a DevOps implementation is for you.
One thing that I wanted to also talk about for the fall with .NET Core 3 is .NET DevOps for Azure, my latest book. And at the Build Conference, we released the preview edition, distributed several hundred copies, autographed a whole bunch, and it's working its way to Amazon. I wanted to get it out really, really quick and get a preview edition going. But you can find the book right now, aka.ms/.NET DevOps book, and you can buy it now. If you are running a user group or a local conference and we like to support that, I'd be happy to send 2 print copies of that book to give away at your user group event. Just reach out and be happy to do that for you. But even though we're in the final proofing stages of kind of getting it published and out to the distribution channels, it'll be on Amazon, Barnes & Noble soon, and I can't wait for that to happen. But at the same time, I'm planning the next edition of the book, and I'm planning that edition for this fall. And so the intent is for the book to be aligned with .NET Core 3. So obviously the book will have to come out after .NET Core 3 comes out, but be aligned with that. And there are some additional, along with updates to the existing book content, which covers the entire DevOps environment from planning and work management to source control to private builds, all the way through automated observability in Azure, how to automatically create environments, 100% automated DevOps pipeline, as well as 3 tiers of test automation, static code analysis, inspections, and pull requests. Along with the content that's in the book being updated, there's 4 more topics that I want to add for this next edition of the book. And we'll see if I get to all 4 of them and have 4 standalone chapters, or if some of them are combined. But one of the topics is security and how to handle security in a DevOps pipeline, because the first way of DevOps is flow, where we want to automate things and flow things out. But if we don't have the right checks or filters or tests, then we're just going to accelerate the flow of defects out to our users, and we don't want to do that. And the security category of defects is just as important as the functional category of defects, where it has to function properly. Well, it also has to be secure. If we have security flaws, then that severely puts our users at risk, and the company at risk. And so I'm planning on putting together a chapter on security about how to not only protect your code that you're shipping, but also the data and privacy of your users, and the techniques for working those into a DevOps pipeline. Based on your architecture, you're going to have to select the methods of security validation, but I hope to be able to give some guidance on where and how to wire in those types of methods and some popular products into your pipeline. Another topic that I want to work in is containers. And that's really a runtime variation of, okay, we have an application and its destination is containers, but this one actually has some paradigm shifting, because when you are deploying to PaaS services or VMs, your application is going to be packaged up as NuGet packages. And with containers, there's a lot of discussion out in the industry of not packaging up the application as a NuGet package, but actually packaging up the application components themselves as Docker containers using that format. And that has some ramifications to how the DevOps tools are configured and what is stored in Azure Artifacts as the package management tool, and as well as how to automatically provision this type of environment for pre-production scenarios as well as production. That's very different from Azure PaaS and very different from a Windows server or a VM runtime environment. The next topic that I think everyone needs more guidance on, and I hope to be able to include, is about database pipelines. Now, the current book as it stands has the database as a owned component of the application itself. And normally that's the way we want to do it, and especially for applications that you're starting today. However, there are just scores of applications that have been written 10 years ago, 20 years ago, and then modified and upgraded over time. And it's very, very common to have an application that doesn't own the database that it relies on. And so we have so many of those applications out there in the wild where actually you might have 10 different applications in different Git repositories, and you're manually deploying them, and they all have a connection string to a database. You can't say that any one of those applications owns the database. And so you have to think, okay, well, what pipeline do I put the database in? And so architecturally, if we realize that we have a situation like that, then we have to declare that, for better or for worse, the database itself that we have is a standalone software application. Therefore, it needs its own pipeline, starting with its own Git repository, its own build, its own packaging, its own deployments, and its own tests and various static analysis and feedback mechanisms. And so I hope to be able to put some guidance together on how to do database-only pipelines because there's so many of those out there. We can all say, oh yeah, just rewrite it or just refactor the big monolith into microservices. And you can hand wave and say that, but that's millions of dollars of investment for these older systems. And we have to have ways and have to have patterns in order to incrementally modernize these systems into the new DevOps and cloud world. So that'll be an important topic. And the fourth one that I want to get in for this next edition is DevOps for microservices. Because again, this is another paradigm change where instead of a very large Visual Studio solution where everything is versioned together, everything is deployed together, it's the paradigm where you say, you know what, I would have a big application. There does need to be 2 different web applications and 3 different web API applications and maybe even some WCF services. And then there's these 17 backend jobs. Some has scheduled tasks, some has Windows services. Maybe you've upgraded some of them to be Azure functions or web jobs, but either way, they're offline jobs. And then you have your database schema or several. And then you also have a different database schema for your data warehouse, or even just a mirrored copy of the database so that reports don't go against your transactional instance. And you have all these things and you realize, a lot of these backend jobs for sure can be developed and deployed on an independent cadence than the rest of it. And so you say, okay, well, those can be standalone services. And you figure out how to make the architectural changes so that they truly are autonomous. And then you figure out what part of the database schema they should own. You factor out the data store needs of just that service, and then you figure out how to integrate that back into the whole system now that you have essentially a multi-application software system, because the levels of a software system are the software system as a whole, and then you have multiple applications that are independently versioned and controlled and deployed. And applications can either be a user application or it could be a backend job. Application could also be called a service. And so generally microservices are just making things smaller and independent. And it's funny that almost 20 years ago, we were talking about service-oriented architecture or SOA. And one of the tenets of a service in the SOA days was that it was autonomous and it owned its own data stores. And so we kind of have that same principle with microservices. But when you have a number of Git repositories that are the start of a number of independent DevOps pipelines, we need patterns for aggregating multiple DevOps pipelines, each representing a microservice, back into the whole. And how do you set up a complete system environment? How do you deploy or provision the complete system and aggregate all those together, as well as logging and telemetry and custom events and how to support and have observability characteristics across the whole system. So that'll be important. And so I hope to have those topics covered in the book. Also, I'm considering delivering the contents of the book as a series of video trainings. And if you think video training would be appropriate, reach out to me on Twitter and let me know. And also considering custom courses based on the book. Plenty of clients have already reached out and we've delivered courses either on the book or on segments. And actually, I just delivered a training this past week, and it had a special emphasis on Octopus Deploy integrated with Azure DevOps services, and that was the great training. Also, let me know if I should offer a custom course that anyone could come to, a public course where if you would fly into Austin in order to come to a public course with engineers from various other organizations, let me know and I might put that on the calendar. All right, so again, you can go to aka.ms/.NET DevOps book, and you can buy the book today. It'll be on Amazon shortly, but you can buy it directly from the book manufacturer today. That's that URL. I talked about security. One of the products that a lot of people are using today based on security is Preemptive's .Fuscator. And I mentioned Blazor, and of course with Xamarin Apps, we're going to be shipping a lot more code to users that are running on computers that we don't control. And so just to protect the code, obfuscation is going to become a lot more important again. Whereas, in the age of web applications, maybe some people didn't use obfuscation of .NET as much as they did in the WinForms or WPF days, but for sure obfuscated the JavaScript with minification, because if you're going to ship the code, that sometimes can be intellectual property and you don't want to do that. Okay. There's one product feature with Octopus Deploy that is really interesting. I know we have a lot of people who use that extension from the Azure DevOps Marketplace integrated with their pipelines, and that is the new worker role, and that is with PaaS environments and with load balancers or databases that are not going to be deployment targets themselves as VMs. It allows us to integrate worker roles that can create a brand new cloud environment, that can touch resources like load balancers, that can run deployment steps on servers with specific capabilities. And if you're concerned about arbitrary code execution on the Octopus server itself, you can offload it to any number of other worker agents on different servers other than the servers that are actually your production servers. So that's an interesting feature at octopus.com/workers. And then the last piece of news that I want to throw out is just the capability to see what is up and coming in Azure DevOps itself. And I think as of the 9th of June, 2019, which is just a couple weeks ago, there was the last update to the features timeline. And you can go to docs.microsoft.com/en-us/azure/devops/release-notes. And you can keep on coming back to this and just see quarter by quarter, date by date, the different features that they're planning on working on. And they're pretty transparent about what is prioritized for the future. So if you have a particular feature or capability that you like an update on, you can see if it's even been prioritized, or at least see what's coming up next. So that has been DevOps news, and I hope it's been useful. If there's some additional news that I missed that we can incorporate in one of the upcoming shows, then just send me a note on Twitter at Jeffrey Palermo. And until next time, keep shipping.
You've been listening to the Azure DevOps Podcast, a show for developers and DevOps professionals shipping software using Microsoft technologies. Go to www.azuredevops.show for show notes and other episodes. On behalf of your host, Jeffrey Palermo, and our sponsors, thanks for listening, and may God bless you.